Hello, everyone. I hope that you're having a lovely Friday morning. If you're in Chicago, it is sunny, which is amazing. And so now that I've started this like a radio broadcaster, I just want to introduce myself. So my name is Sierra Peterson, and I am the training coordinator at NAMI Chicago. My background is in social work. So prior to working at NAMI Chicago, I got my master's in social work from the University of Chicago. I have background in direct service with clients, including case management. And right now, in terms of my primary role at NAMI Chicago, I facilitate mental health training, I coordinate mental health training, and I develop curriculum for a variety of groups, including first responders, corporations, and others looking to increase their mental health knowledge. And I want to thank Torlin from All Chicago for having me come talk to you today. Torlin, are there any ground rules you'd like to set in terms of how to navigate the WebEx platform?
So the only thing I'm asking the audience, if you're having trouble with your audio, please click on the audio button. It has some instructions of how you can actually do that. And then if you have any questions as it relates to anything in the presentation, please type it in the questions pane so that I can share it with Sierra. And at the very end of the presentation, if you can be so kind as to copy the actual survey link so that we can give Sierra some feedback on today's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, so please add your questions. I'm happy to answer any questions at different points throughout the presentation. I'm also throughout the presentation going to ask you to engage in a little bit. So the first thing I would love for you to do is if you could put your name and your organization and your position in the chat, or any variety of what you feel comfortable with. I would love to see who's on the call today and hopefully speak to some of the things that you're seeing in your field. So now that I've provided you with a little bit of information about me, I'm going to talk to you about what this presentation is going to cover. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about NAMI Chicago. So NAMI stands for the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and we are the Chicago area affiliate of this national organization. So I'm going to talk to you about the programs that we have. I'm going to talk to you about our free and confidential helpline that you can use to get connected to mental health care, where you can help a client get connected to mental health care. And so I will explain our helpline in detail. I'm also going to talk to you about our mission and why NAMI Chicago is very different from other mental health organizations and how we conceptualize mental wellness. The next thing I'm going to talk to you about is basic mental health awareness. So today, I do not want you to leave this presentation feeling that now you have the burden of diagnosing the people around you. I want you to understand that the most important thing you can do around diagnosing or not diagnosing, but identifying warning signs is just being mindful. It's paying attention to if someone's experience, it is important to know when to connect with someone and to just basically have the idea that mental health might be something that someone's struggling with. So we'll talk to you a little bit about mental health in that way. The third piece I want to talk to you about is crisis intervention and de-escalation skills, because this is so important in your role, but also just in regular everyday life. Having an understanding of how to intervene in a crisis and de-escalate someone verbally is so important. So we're going to go over some basic skills that we actually use to empower first responders and other groups in terms of de-escalation. And then I believe this is a little bit out of order. So I think that I changed it. So we're actually going to go through a few scenarios. And what I'll ask you to do is to put some things in the chat regarding how you would respond, and then we can go through that. And then finally, there will be a designated Q&A period. So if you have a question towards the end of the presentation, we can chat about that as well. So now I'd love to get started in talking to you about NAMI Chicago. The mission of NAMI Chicago is to provide hope and improve the quality of life for those whose lives are affected by mental health conditions, as well as their family members. NAMI Chicago's mission starts from NAMI's existence. I believe it was in the 70s, when a group of mothers came together who had loved ones who were struggling with mental illness. Now, back in the 70s, our mental health system looked different, and it was even harder to get access to mental health care at that time. But these mothers, they were parents of adult children. So that means that they were parents of adults who are over the age of 18. And if you've ever had someone in your life who's over the age of 18 who's struggling with anything from addiction to mental health conditions, it can be very, very hard as a family member to engage with them, because you can't get them into treatment. You can't make them, address their mental health. And even if someone wants to address their mental health, it can be very, very hard. So these mothers felt like they didn't have any support, they didn't have anywhere to go, and they didn't have anywhere to get connection. So they got together and started what now is NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, which is the nation's largest grassroots mental health organization. NAMI has expanded to not only include our national office, but NAMIs that are in each of the 52 states. So there's a NAMI Illinois, and then NAMIs all over the country have local affiliates. So we are within city limits, the Chicago area affiliate. That doesn't mean we don't help people who are from the suburbs or looking to get information about a loved one or how to support another person in the suburbs. We're able to help in that way, but there are NAMIs in the suburbs that provide direct service. One thing to note about NAMI Chicago in particular is we are not a direct service organization. So we do not provide psychiatrists, we do not have therapists on staff, but we do offer support groups. I'll talk a little bit about that. We really function as an advocacy organization that focuses on training. We focus on facilitating connection to mental health care and advocating for a more just system regarding mental health. So one thing I want to pay attention to, and I want you to understand about NAMI Chicago that makes us very unique, is we have a very particular understanding of mental wellness. A lot of us know what it means to kind of be struggling with our mental health, even in our personal lives. It might be easier for us to understand when we're not feeling well, but how many of us actually pay attention to when we do feel well? And so what we like to understand in terms of mental health is that mental health is not just therapy. It is not just the meeting you have once a month with a psychiatrist. It is not just when you take your medication in the morning. Mental health can be those things, and that those components are very important and also an individual choice. But mental health also includes these 4 components of the recovery model. The recovery model, it comes from the United States Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA, and it's how SAMHSA governs, or it's how SAMHSA identifies mental health recovery. So the first of 4 components of the mental health recovery model is health. So as I said, of course, mental health care is very important, but your physical health also matters. So are you eating well? Are you sleeping well? Do you have access in your community to nutritious foods? Do you have the ability to work out? Are you able to really invest in your health and have quality health care? Those are components that are very, very important to mental health. The second piece is home. And so home is not only the place where, people keep their medication or feel safe. Home is also a place where people can recharge and engage in their resilience and their coping strategies. Home is also a place where we hopefully have people in our lives that we feel supported around. And so when we're thinking about mental health, we know it's very, very hard to feel mentally well when you don't have a home that's affordable, that's safe, where you feel supported. And I know as housing providers and working in the housing field, you, as compared to so many people in the general population, understand the importance of having affordable, safe, calming housing. And so when we're thinking about mental health and the ways that people can be more mentally well, we always think of their home and how can they improve that? How can they get connected to housing? And that's very, very important. The third piece is purpose. Purpose is a little bit harder to pinpoint because a lot of us imagine that we have to have a really grand life purpose. At some point in my life, I thought that I had to know exactly what I wanted to do. Prior to working at NAMI Chicago and prior to grad school, I really, really thought that I was going to be working only in the domestic violence field or the sexual assault field. And now I realize that purpose really is what matters in your life at the moment that you can make meaning out of. So we know that if someone doesn't have a purpose, if they don't have a reason to get up in the morning or they don't feel hope, we know it's going to be so hard for them to engage in mental health and feel better, regardless of if they have a therapist and, medication and maybe their home is okay. We know that if someone doesn't feel that there is, a light at the end of the tunnel, we know it's very hard for them to be mentally well. So when we're thinking about mental health and we're working with people on our helpline and we're, working with people in our support group, we are focusing on purpose. We're trying to make sure that people understand that they have meaning, and that meaning can come in so many different ways. It can be in your job. It can also be in the time you spend with your family. It can be in that one-to-one client interaction that you have that gets you through the day. It can be anything from volunteering to the moments that you have with your therapist. So when we're thinking about purpose, we know that it's so important for mental health. And finally, community. So community is one of the most important things around mental health. If people have all of these components already in line, but they don't have community, it can be very hard for people to engage in mental wellness. We know from research that having community and connection with other people is what heals us. It's what heals us from trauma. It's what connects us and makes us feel, just better about life. And especially for someone who's living with a mental health condition, when there's so much stigma, so many barriers to mental health care, we know that community is so important. So community can be anything from it could be someone's family, it could be their friends, it could be their work community. I know personally for me, my community is my NAMI community. I believe we have a really unique workplace culture where we're always checking in with each other. We have good, transparent relationships. And so therefore, that's my community. When I'm feeling down, I can go to work and I can talk to my coworkers in a way that's still professional, but I can have a conversation with them and let them know how I'm feeling, and it builds me up. And the same thing could be for another person. It might be their support group, and that might be their community. It might be their time with their grandparents. That could be their community. And so we know that this connection is so important. And one thing that's really hard about community is that sometimes people feel that they genuinely do not have a place to turn. I had a call with a gentleman on our helpline the other night that lasted 20 minutes. And I believe we just talked about, what he was having for dinner, what hobbies he wanted to engage in. And it was clear to me in that moment that I was his community. And so we like to serve as that function in our society where we can be the community for people who maybe feel isolated. And so I'll talk to you a little bit more about our helpline in just a second. So the most important resource we have at NAMI Chicago is our helpline. Our helpline operates 7 days a week. We take calls in English and Spanish, and that's the number right there. So I would suggest that you put this number into your phone just to save it, especially if you're someone who works in direct service as maybe a program supervisor or a case manager or someone who works with youth. It is a great resource to have. So the number you should put in your phone is 833-626-4244. And as you can see, those are our hours. So 7 days a week, you can call and you can talk to someone who has advanced clinical training. The vast majority of us on our helpline actually have our master's in social work degree, and we're there to help you navigate the mental health system. So our helpline was actually born out of the fact that so many people struggle to find mental health care. If you've ever tried to find a therapist for yourself and you've tried to navigate, finding a therapist without insurance, or trying to navigate, trying to even navigate finding a therapist with insurance, it can be incredibly difficult. And so much of the time, we put the burden on the person who is suffering to try to navigate the mental health system. We know that there is a ton of stigma around mental health, which is awful. And so this person might be feeling like they can't connect with others because maybe they have had to work through a ton of stigma to get mental health care. And then on top of it, a lot of times people reach out and try to get help when they're not feeling well. It's not like, for me, even personally, I'm not more inclined to go to therapy when I'm just having a really good day and I've been exercising and I've been eating well and engaging in my coping resources. Those aren't the days where I'm thinking, I really need to see a therapist that would be really helpful for me. The days where I think that I need to go see a therapist are the days when I'm feeling disconnected, or maybe I'm having a day where I'm feeling very, very emotional, or I'm feeling like I can't talk to anyone about this, or I'm feeling out of control and I don't know how to feel better. And those are the times when people reach out to the mental health system, and those are the times that they're met with all of the barriers to mental health care. So maybe someone can't find a therapist because they don't have the right insurance. Maybe someone is from a community where they are trying to find a therapist that looks like them. And we know that our mental health system is primarily built for white people. Maybe we have people who are lower income and they can't afford the copays, or maybe the wait list is so long to be on a sliding scale wait list, that it's extremely hard to get in. And so the reality is that people are reaching out when they're struggling, and they're being met with a system that can't meet their needs. And at the end of the day, there might be a wait list, so they can't even get in when they need to. And so that's where NAMI Chicago stepped in. Our helpline was created years ago because we know that there needs to be a singular place where someone can call and we can help you provide a warm handoff to getting mental health care. So our clinicians are trained to talk to people about, maybe to ask the right questions around what they might need to know regarding what mental health treatment they need, whether it's a therapist, a psychiatrist, maybe they need a support group, or maybe they don't need any of those in that moment and they just need a listening ear. So that's what we're here for, is to provide that calm, reassuring connection to care. We also follow up with about 2/3 of our callers. So our callers often call us and we give them specialized referrals from our database. And then what happens is we'll call the next week or in the next couple weeks and say, hey, how are things going? Did you get connected to care? Is there anything else we can do for you? Do you want to stay in touch? And we will do that. And we'll continue to go back and build these relationships. Another thing that we can do is help someone else support a loved one or someone that they care about who's struggling with their mental health. So we receive calls from about 50%. About 50% of our calls are actually from friends or family members who are worried about a loved one and don't know what to do and don't know where to turn. One thing about our helpline is that we're able to help you create a game plan. And like I said, this is free. So you can just call us and talk to a clinician who reports back to our team, and we will work with you to find the best resource for your loved one. We get calls from parents of young children, parents of children over the age of 18. We get calls from spouses who are worried. We get calls from people who just have a friend, then they can just unload on us and say, these are the things that I've noticed. What do you think about that? Do you think this could be a mental health condition? And we can help create a game plan. And then finally, we also serve as a thought partner just for creating a game plan in a professional setting. So say you're a case manager and maybe you don't know a whole lot about bipolar disorder, but you wonder if this client who you think maybe has bipolar disorder, or maybe they're going through a manic episode, you think that you need a little bit more information before approaching them and having a conversation. We can work with you to develop a game plan. We can provide basic mental health education to you over the phone, talking to you about signs and symptoms, and we can let you know what different resources there are out there for them. So those are some things to note. Our helpline is very, it's very busy. We have thousands of calls each year. Just through the COVID-19 pandemic, we've actually increased our call volume by 300%. So we've had to hire a bunch of new staff. We have more bilingual staff now. And so we're happy to offer this resource. And finally, the last thing you can use for our helpline is to help people connect to basic needs. So we at NAMI Chicago get calls all the time from individuals who maybe they need mental health care, but also their kids are hungry. And we want to make sure that they're getting access to food or they're getting access to housing. So we have been partnering with the city of Chicago to provide food from pantries, food from Instacart and other resources to people in need on a limited basis, of course. It's kind of case by case. But then also we've been housing families in hotels who really just need somewhere to go for the night or to go for a week. And of course, this is on a limited basis as well, but just know if you don't know where to turn, we can probably be helpful in that way. We also have resources around legal needs, around housing, anything you can imagine, we can be helpful with. So please call us. So right now I want to pause and I want to see if anyone has any questions about our helpline in the chat.
Sierra, I don't see any at the moment coming from the question pane.
Okay, great.
Mm-hmm.
You all are going to have to hear me drink my coffee. I'm sorry. Okay, perfect. So that's our helpline. Please utilize us. We're here for you. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about it in different ways that can be helpful throughout. The last thing I'll note is that sometimes in housing situations, but sometimes in our personal lives, we might have someone around us who's in crisis. They might be in full-blown mental health crisis, and there might be an issue of safety. If you are feeling that there's no other option but to call the police, we'll talk to you about CIT throughout this presentation, which is Crisis Intervention Team Training. But if you are feeling like you need a game plan in terms of interacting with the police, I know that it's a risky situation. and they should be a last resort. But if you are having a very big crisis situation or you anticipate there is one, please call us. We have relationships with police departments and we can be helpful. So other things that NAMI Chicago does, we facilitate support groups that are free, and right now they're virtual. So we have support groups that are run for peers, or what we like to call are people with lived experience of mental health conditions. So these peers run support groups that are recovery focused, that you can attend as a person who just identifies with living with a mental health condition or struggling with their mental health, or you just want a place to connect. So it's not specifically for people who have a diagnosis, although of course that's helpful for understanding yourself sometimes. We open it up to anyone in the community who needs support, because we know that the ability to get a mental health diagnosis is just something some of us don't have. It's so hard to get into a psychiatrist. There's a ton of stigma. And we also know that people are misdiagnosed sometimes as well. So if you are just feeling like you need a place to connect, you can call into our support group. Another thing we offer is we offer a support group for family and friends of people who live with mental health conditions that need support. And this support group is very popular. So we have a lot of parents who have a child or an adult child who's struggling with their mental health that come just to connect and do resource sharing and just be able to, provide more support around what it's like to be a caregiver to someone who's struggling with their mental health. And when I say caregiver, I don't necessarily mean caregiver in the sense that it's like a full-time job or you're, working on someone's basic needs. I mean caregiver in that if you are providing emotional support to someone and you are feeling stressed or you are feeling powerless and you don't know how to engage with the mental health system on their behalf, that's what this group is for. So for example, I have family members in my life who live with mental health conditions. And I also live with several mental health conditions myself, including anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And so I know what it's like on both sides. I know what it's like to be the person who's extremely worried about a friend or family member, and you feel powerless and you don't know what to do, and you're just waiting for the next shoe to drop. But I also know what it's like on the other side of it to need support from those around me. So these groups are great regardless of what's going on in your life. So please consider going. And then finally, we also have a support group that is for essential workers that has started a few months ago from all of the stress that's going through the COVID-19 pandemic. So essential workers can be anyone who is still working with others amidst this pandemic. So it could be anything from a grocery store cashier to a doctor to a case manager to a therapist. So please attend that if you would like as well. And so I see a question, do you have support groups just for teens? So no, we don't, but we can, if you call our helpline, we can be very, very helpful in terms of finding one for you. So that actually, I hope that answered your questions, but please let us know if we can be helpful, or if you have any specific questions around teen support, we can be really helpful in that regard. So we facilitate support groups. We also facilitate educational courses. So we have one that's like 8 weeks long that family members can go to, where they learn everything about navigating a mental health crisis. We also have one for individuals who want to create their Wellness Recovery Action Plan, or WRAP plan. Other things that we do is we provide mental health training at schools. So we do training with youth in terms of Chicago Public Schools and other schools around the city. We do training with workplaces on workplace wellness. I actually Torlin and I spoke about workplace wellness training and how it might be a good resource for you all. And then faith communities. We also do training with faith communities, because we know if someone's engaged in their faith community, be it their church or wherever their institution is, we know that that is a place that people go to when they have a mental health condition, often before they talk to anyone else. And so we want to ensure that those points of contact have mental health knowledge so they can respond in an unstigmatizing way. Another thing we do is we train first responders on how to respond to a mental health crisis. So I will talk to you towards the end of the presentation about crisis intervention team training. I'm going to talk to you about how it's a resource, but I'm also going to talk to you about its faults and how our mental health system is really not equipped to handle mental health crisis. But we train first responders, everything from the Chicago Fire Department to the Cook County Sheriffs to the Chicago Police Department, and then to OEMC, which is our 911 call taking center in the city of Chicago. A few other things we do, we also do some direct service through programs through the state. So we help people move into nursing home facilities. They're called SMRFs, but they're essentially just residential facilities for people with mental health conditions. And we also help people move out into the community independently. And finally, we do policy advocacy. We see so many cases of mental health conditions. We see the stigma, we see the barriers to care, and we want to make sure that people have access. So in terms of why we do all of these things, it's really to advocate at a higher level and make sure our system is changing. Does anyone have any questions about NAMI Chicago?
No, I don't see anything at the moment, Sierra.
Great. Okay, perfect. Did we have people introduce themselves?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know why I can't see it. But anyway, thank you so much for introducing yourselves. I'm really excited to be on this training with you. So let's get into it. So what is mental health? As we talked about the recovery model, or as I talked about in the recovery model, a lot of us know what mental illness is. And of course, we're going to touch on what mental illness is. But what is mental health and what are the components of mental health for all of us? So one thing I want you to know is that mental health is something that everyone can experience. So everyone can engage in their mental health and support their mental health, regardless of what resources we have. We're here to help you support your mental health. So when we're thinking about mental health, I want you to think of these 4 components. When someone is not mentally well, it is extremely hard for them to engage in these 4 things. The first thing is productive activity. So in terms of productive activity, that can mean a variety of things. For me, what makes me feel productive is when I work out, when I actually cook at home and I don't buy takeout. There are things that make me feel very productive. It might be having a really good day at work where I get a lot done. But for someone else, their level of productivity, depending on what's going on in their life, depending on their disposition as a person, their level of productivity might be very different, and that's okay. And especially if someone experiences a mental health condition where they're experiencing a setback in terms of what they once viewed as productive, it's important not to judge if your level of productivity goes up or down. So for example, if I'm experiencing depression or I'm having, I've been feeling depressed for a while, my level of productivity might not be eating well, cooking. It might not be, going to work and having a productive day. My productivity might be, I got out of bed and showered today. It might be, I had a conversation that I was really not looking forward to. It might be, I ended up in my therapist's office and I'm very happy about that. So it's important to note that your mental health in terms of productivity, it's important not to judge yourself as to where you're at. Similarly, when we're thinking about other people who have maybe experienced trauma, maybe they're experiencing poverty, there's like lots of things going on in their life, we have to give them grace in terms of productive activity. So if you have a client who maybe their productive activity is just getting to the meeting that you have with them to fill out intake paperwork, that is important to recognize. It's important to validate that and let them know that you see how important it was for them to get to you today. So when we're thinking about mental health, our productive activity is actually the first thing to go. And so it's important to note, when do you feel productive? But when you're not feeling productive, what are the things that immediately go for you? So for me, when I'm really struggling, I know I'm struggling if I am not getting out of my house, I'm not calling people. So it's important to know what productive activity is for you. Another component of mental health, we touched on this with community, is fulfilling relationships. So when we're thinking about fulfilling relationships, we're thinking about relationships where you can go to them and they will build you back up. I'm sure some of you have experienced people in your life, and for no fault of their own, when you talk to them on the phone or you have a meeting with them, you end up feeling drained. So maybe they spend the whole time venting, maybe they don't ask you questions about yourself, maybe it's like a one-way street. And so those aren't the relationships I'm talking about, even if you care about someone. So sometimes the relationships that aren't fulfilling might be a friend, it might be a family member, it might be your partner at a certain point in time. And so when we're thinking about fulfilling relationships, I want you to think about your ability to engage with people that build you back up. So we need to have those people in our lives. And so that might be a friend, it could be your boss, it could be your coworker, So thinking about, am I engaging in fulfilling relationships, because they're a key component of mental health. Another component of mental health is the ability to adapt to change. When we're not feeling mentally well, our ability to adapt to change is very, very difficult. Okay, one second. Torlin, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. My headphones were being a little wonky, so I'm just taking them out. But when we're thinking about mental health, I also want you to think about our ability to adapt to change as something that is a key indicator of if we're doing well or not. So if you're having a really difficult time around transition, it might mean that you need to focus more on your wellness. It might mean that you're not engaging in your coping strategies and the things that make you feel good in the way that you normally do. So how do you know if you're struggling with your ability to adapt to change? One example that is really relevant is that in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, our office went from we transitioned barely from working from the office to working totally from home. And so for some of our team, it was a really easy transition. You know, some of us felt actually excited about not having to commute. Some of us felt better about having time to do workouts from home, to spend more time with our families. But some of my coworkers who weren't really doing well prior to the pandemic, for whatever reason, whether it's living with a mental health condition that they've been struggling with lately, or maybe there was stress in terms of their job or their personal life, for people who were struggling with their mental health prior to the pandemic, this transition to working from home was a lot more difficult for them. They felt disconnected. They maybe felt like it was hard to wrap their head around how their job had changed. And so when there's that issue with bouncing back from an ability to adapt to change, it might be a sign that someone needs more support. Similarly, it's also important to note that any change that is very quick and fast is something that can cause trauma. When we have unexpected change, it can be a traumatic event. And right now, as a culture, or as a society, we're experiencing this transition. It's a huge transition into a whole new world. And so it's a very, very hard, and so many people are struggling. So when we are not feeling well, our ability to adapt to change is altered. And then finally, our ability to deal with adversity. Adversity happens. A lot of us have experienced things, and we will experience things in our life that is very, very difficult for us. But when we're not doing well, our experience of adversity is going to be harder to get over. So when we're thinking about mental health, if you're feeling mentally healthy, your ability to bounce back is going to be a lot faster. So for example, if I am in a car accident with my brother, and say it's a car accident where, it was just scary, it was really sudden. If he is doing better, say he's been engaging in his coping mechanisms, he's doing well, he has a lot of stability in his life, he might not be as rattled. But for me, if I'm not doing well at that time, I might be completely rattled, and it might turn into a point where I'm experiencing like a traumatic reaction. And so we need to really focus on our mental health, especially as people in helping professions. It is so important to think about ourselves and prioritize our mental wellness. So one thing I want you to note is, in the same way I talked about productive activity, each person's components of mental health are different, including our warning signs. Someone's warning signs might be totally different than another person's warning signs, and they might, and so that's something to really pay attention to. One concept I want you to pay attention to is baseline. So all of us have a baseline functioning. Basically, it's how we interact on any given day, and it's our behaviors, it's our thought, it's our mood, it's our physical health on any given day. And so when we're thinking about, is someone struggling, and we're trying to figure out, maybe are they going through something? Do they need support? Are they doing okay? I want you to reflect back on baseline. We know what someone's baseline functioning is. If we have trust with them, if we see them, we can tell if they're behaving in a way that they normally do. And so when you're thinking about, and you're kind of going back and forth in your head about whether or not to reach out about mental health or whether or not to provide a resource, I want you to reflect on baseline for other people, but also for yourself. You know when something's off with yourself, and your gut tells you when something's off with another person. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But before I move on, I was wondering if there are any questions, Torlin, that anyone has so far.
No, not at the moment, Sierra. There was a question There was a question I sent. Will you be able to provide any sort of training for homeless shelters?
Yes, so we provide specialized training to different groups. And so, Torlin, we can also talk about that. But in terms of trainings that we provide a lot of different trainings. We provide not only trainings like this, where it's basic mental health awareness, we also provide more in-depth exercises on crisis intervention and de-escalation. We provide more trainings that focus on like co-occurring disorders. So there are things that we can do. So it depends on what your needs are, but please feel free to reach out to me if you'd like after the presentation. My email is Sierra, SIERRA, at NAMI-Chicago.org. You can also find me on our website as well. So I'm happy to talk to you about training opportunities for whatever housing program you're in. So with that, thank you, Torlin. I'm going to move into what are mental health conditions. A lot of us have a basic understanding about what a mental health condition is. And a lot of us, unfortunately, our understanding of mental health conditions is really colored by the popular media. I know that when I grew up, I didn't have conversations about mental health conditions in my family. I really just knew about mental health from seeing things like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, hearing people say stigmatizing language around people who were crazy or mentally ill. I didn't have an understanding about what mental health conditions were. When I got older and I started experiencing mental health symptoms myself, I didn't have the understanding, I didn't have the mental health knowledge to know that this is something that could be treated. And so that's what's a shame about mental health conditions in our society, is we have a very narrow view about what they are. So in terms of mental health conditions, I want you to think about mental health conditions as affecting not only, your thoughts, it's also your behavior, it's your mood, and it's also your ability to function. One of the questions that we often get around mental health conditions is that we don't know. So for example, someone reaches out to our helpline and says, I've been feeling really down lately. I haven't wanted to connect with others. Do I have major depressive disorder? And when we're thinking about mental health conditions, I don't want you to think about diagnosis so much as I want you to think about the signs. So one thing to note about when you might need professional help regarding a mental health condition or symptoms is this pervasive? So are the symptoms that someone is experiencing pervasive through every aspect of their life or most aspects of their life? So for example, maybe someone's having panic attacks because they're feeling really anxious. Are these panic attacks pervasive in all different aspects of their life? Are they feeling anxious in the car? Are they feeling anxious when they wake up? Are they having a hard time in meetings at work? Like, these are some things to think about. Are these symptoms pervasive through areas of their life? Or is it in relation to just different situations? So if something's pervasive, it might mean that more professional help is needed. But one key point is that persistence is something that's very, very important to pay attention to with mental health conditions. So say this person who's feeling anxious is engaging in their coping strategies. So maybe they know that going on a run really helps them, or talking to their mom really helps them, or maybe, making sure that they're taking time for themselves and eating healthy. And so maybe they are doing all of these things. They're putting a ton of effort, into as much effort as they can amidst feeling anxious, into their coping strategies. And these feelings are persisting or getting worse. That might mean that there needs to be more professional help. So when someone's diagnosed, it's often related to pervasiveness and persistence. So just the appearance of symptoms doesn't mean that maybe someone needs professional help. It might mean they need to reevaluate what support they're giving themselves and they're getting from others. But paying attention to pervasiveness and persistence is key. And so I know that I am talking about mental health in a way that's kind of deficit-based, like the things that we feel when we're not well. But what I want you to know, and throughout this presentation, what I want you to pay attention to, is that mental health conditions are very common and they're very treatable. So mental health conditions are extremely common. 1 in 5 adults in the United States will experience a mental health condition in their lifetime. And 1 in 25 adults in the United States will actually experience a serious mental health condition like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. And so we know that these are very common. And if you don't know people in your life who've experienced mental health conditions, it might mean that they don't feel comfortable talking about it. You know, a lot of times with mental health conditions, it's very, very hard to come out and talk about it and be open about your mental health experience. But we know that statistically, in terms of the, 52 people on the line, I can't do math, but that means a lot of us are probably living with mental health conditions. And we also know that mental health conditions are very treatable. And we know that it takes time to find the treatment that works with you. A lot of times with mental health conditions, we think that, okay, I'm going to go to a therapist, it's going to get better. And that is not the case. It's often a journey, as with many things in life, it's often a journey we have to really just work on throughout our life and keep approaching over and over and over again. But they are treatable with the right amount of medication, if that's someone's choice, with the right therapist, with the right changes in someone's lifestyle. Mental health conditions can be recovered from. So what causes mental health disruption? Like what would cause someone to experience a mental health condition? And there are a variety of things that people might experience that might cause a mental health condition. I would love if people could put in the chat what they believe causes a mental health condition, and then we can go over it. Torlin, do we have anybody who has taken a shot at this? Okay, perfect. We see family history. Yes. So one of the things that can cause mental health disruption is if someone has a genetic tie to a mental health condition. This is very particular. It's very strong for certain conditions versus others. So it might be things like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. Often there is a mental health tie. I believe for schizophrenia, there has to be a genetic component, at least somewhere in the family tree. With bipolar disorder, you don't necessarily have to have a genetic component, but it is really rare if you get bipolar disorder or get experience those symptoms without having a genetic tie. So genetics play a huge role in this. Another piece is trauma. Yes, so trauma. And I think that death of a child, I see that as well. Experiencing a sudden loss, experiencing a sudden event where you lost control can also lead to mental health conditions. So when we're thinking about trauma, I don't want you to just think about those sudden, huge events that are life-changing, although those are extremely important. So when people think about trauma, they often think of, someone who is in the military, who went to war and came back. We think of someone who had a sudden loss, like the death of a child or a loved one. We think of someone who is in an accident, like a car accident or a house fire or something like that. But what I also want you to think about, especially in terms of your context, working in a place where, if you're working in a housing environment where people are struggling with poverty over a long period of time, where people have maybe experienced violence, whether it's community violence or interpersonal violence, I want you to think about the things that are disruptive to your life that might occur over a long period of time. And for some of us, for most of us, it just seems like a fact of life. But the fact is that people can develop post-traumatic stress disorder and other trauma-related disorders from experiencing cumulative trauma events. So when we think about trauma, I want you to think about what's called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or it's called the ACEs study. So essentially the ACEs study found that when people are in childhood, if they experience an adverse childhood experience, they are likely to experience, not only are they more likely to develop a mental health condition, they're more likely to experience chronic health conditions like heart disease and things like that later in life. And so what are these adverse childhood experiences that constitute trauma? Adverse childhood experiences could be anything from, of course, experiencing like a sudden loss, like a death of a family member, but it also included things that many of us have experienced in our lives, myself included. So substance use from a parent. So if you have parents that struggle with substance use, having a parent who's incarcerated. It's also things like being witness to domestic violence. Of course, it's things like physical and sexual abuse. So when we think about trauma from this broader lens, I want you to realize that this is an epidemic that we as a society need to address. And if you experience trauma, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have a mental health condition, but there is a correlation between the two. All right, so other things that might cause mental health disruption, substance use. Yes, substance abuse can cause mental health conditions. So we don't necessarily know if someone experienced substance use, if they definitely will experience a mental health condition, but we know that it exacerbates symptoms. Also, we have physical conditions, so yes, and life transitions, poverty, these are all things that can definitely cause mental health disruption. So thank you so much for chatting about that. I think that one thing to note about mental health disruption is that we cannot, and a psychiatrist cannot, a doctor cannot pinpoint why someone might develop a mental health condition. And so often when we're working with people who are worried about a loved one or their child, there's so much concern about why did this happen to them or why did this happen to me? And the most important thing to note is that if you're experiencing symptoms and you're reaching out about it, it doesn't necessarily matter why you're experiencing the symptoms. What matters is that you're taking care of yourself. Because unfortunately, we can't pinpoint. If we could, then perhaps we could handle and better treat people living with mental health conditions. But it's important to just note, do you feel like you are unwell, or does another person feel like they're struggling, and how can we support them? So one of the videos I'm actually going to send to Torlin to send after this that would be really helpful as a follow-up is I'm going to send you a TED Talk about trauma that I think will be really helpful, and it goes in depth about the adverse childhood experiences study. So now that we've talked about what causes mental health disruption, I want to go into warning signs. So one thing I didn't do here is go by diagnosis by diagnosis. However, if you have questions about a particular diagnosis, I'm absolutely happy to help you in terms of answering a question about that. So when we're thinking about warning signs, I want you to pay attention to going back to that concept of baseline. Does this person that you're worried about, are they operating in a way that's different from their baseline? And so sometimes people's baseline might seem like a warning sign, but it might just be normal for them. So for example, if I'm a person who isn't very social, maybe I go to work and then I don't like to necessarily go out all the time because I need that time to recharge as an introvert. Like if I'm not connecting with people, that might actually be kind of my baseline functioning, is I just enjoy my alone time. However, if you have a coworker who really enjoys, seeing other people, they're always social, and then you notice that they've been withdrawn for a while, and you notice that they're not instigating going out, maybe that they're not as active or like social at work, that might be a warning sign for them. So I want you to keep that in mind, that it's going to appear differently for each person. So when we're talking about warning signs, these are some things to pay attention to. A persistent sad, anxious, or empty mood. So often when we think about mental health conditions, or we think about something like depression, we think of this very emotional response. So we think of someone who is crying all the time. We think of someone who is feeling out of control with their emotions. But what we don't think about is this empty mood, and that's something that's very important to pay attention to. So does someone seem very numb? Do they feel like they aren't getting as excited about the good things in life, and they aren't as affected when something should be causing an emotional response? As people working in a helping profession, I want to let you know that, especially if you're working in a situation where people are struggling with poverty or you've experienced trauma in your background, one thing that's very important to pay attention to in providers is this empty mood. Sometimes when you see hardship over and over and over again, you can experience what's called secondary trauma, just from hearing the hardship of others. And so when you experience secondary trauma, one sign might be this empty mood, just feeling very numb. Like I've seen it all, and just like walking into a crisis situation and not being as affected as someone should be. So when we're thinking about mood, I want you to pay attention to that empty mood as much as you're paying attention to someone feeling persistently sad or, overly worried. Another warning sign is feelings of guilt, worthlessness, or helplessness. I think those are self-explanatory, but if someone is feeling like they are a burden on other people, that's something to pay attention to. And it might come up in someone saying, literally, I feel like I'm a burden to other people. It might come up when people don't feel that it's worth it for them to go see a therapist because they're not worth it or they don't deserve it. It also might come out if someone feels like they don't deserve good things in life. So maybe if someone's really struggling with self-care, taking time for themselves, that could be a warning sign. And then of course, helplessness. If someone feels very powerless and they feel helpless because of how they're feeling, that's important to note. Of course, loss of interest or pleasure in ordinary activities. So if someone is always going to their yoga class and they stop going, it might be time for you to reach out and say, hey, I noticed that you weren't going to yoga class. Like, is everything going okay? Restlessness, irritability, or anger. Sometimes when we think about irritability or anger, of course, we think of mental health conditions, but I also want you to think about how irritability can show up in relation to all different mental health conditions. For someone who's struggling with anxiety, they actually might be more on edge. So imagine if you could just, this is a little thought exercise. If you could think about a day that you had at work where imagine everything is just going wrong, your boss is in a bad mood, maybe there's just been a ton of paperwork that you can't get to, you have a client who's acting out and making your day very difficult for whatever reason. Of course, you can have empathy for that person. But imagine you're having one of those days where you're at capacity, and then you get home and your partner says something that really rubs you the wrong way, and you react way out of line with what they said. Like, your irritability level is just at an all-time high. And it's because you've been keeping it together. And so you've been keeping it together, you've been trying to just like handle your day and manage everything that's being thrown at you. But imagine that you're anxious. So I want you to think about that. But imagine that you're anxious. Imagine someone is going through their day with their body clenched. They are feeling like they are anticipating the worst throughout the day. They're feeling really physical sensations. Maybe they're sweating. Maybe they're having a hard time calming down. And so that person, it might be easier for them to be irritable. And so you might actually not notice the anxiety part because so many people with mental health conditions are fantastic at hiding it, unfortunately. You might actually see the irritability. So it's important to note that if someone's feeling irritable, they probably need support. Another warning sign is social withdrawal or isolation. So if someone's not engaging in the way that they normally do, or if you're not feeling like reaching out to people, that might be a sign. And then finally, excessively cheerful, high, or euphoric mood. And so this isn't just a mood where, you're feeling like, good for the day, like you've had a lot of coffee and you're feeling great. This is excessively cheerful, excessively euphoric. So it might seem like someone is using substances. It might seem like someone is, just feeling so good, and it might be a complete deviation from their baseline. Like maybe you've never seen them this happy before. That's something to pay attention to as well. So that is a symptom of bipolar disorder, is mania, when you feel that energy, that high excessive mood. So that might be a sign of that disorder. But also it could be a sign that someone who's been struggling for a really long time is now feeling better. And it might be a huge warning sign. So for example, when someone is feeling suicidal, so say that a client's been struggling with suicidal thoughts for a while. Maybe they have a history of depression, maybe they don't, but that they've been feeling down. If they come into your office and they're experiencing, an extremely high excessive mood, it actually might be a warning sign because there's that huge deviation from baseline. It might mean that they have decided to end their life. And so this is something that we've seen not only on our helpline, but we have colleagues that have seen it in therapeutic practice, where that was actually a time that you should be curious about what's going on and make sure that that person feels supported. So when we're thinking about mood, just think about that baseline. All right, so do we have any questions about mood so far?
No, not at the moment.
Great, perfect. So the next component I want you to think about that is often overlooked when we think about mental health conditions is physical symptoms. So oftentimes people think that physical symptoms of mental health conditions are related to a physical condition and not a mental health condition. We even have doctors that do this. So often we hear of parents who had taken their children in when they were young for things like stomach aches, headaches, not being able to sleep. And then it later turns out that those were signs that they were experiencing a mental health condition later in life. Or maybe there were other emotional conditions that they felt like were separate from those physical conditions. But we know that there is a direct tie between physical and mental health. So one sign is pounding or racing heart. So this is usually related to anxiety, but if it's feeling like you can't calm down or that your body's reacting in this way, it might be a warning sign. Another sign of anxiety is sweating or this tingling feeling, usually in your extremities. So this might be a sign that kind of co-occurs with a panic attack. It might be a sign that you're feeling your body is responding because it's trying to protect you from what you're experiencing. Decreased energy is a huge warning sign. And so when I say decreased energy, I don't mean like, oh, I just need a nap. When I'm thinking about decreased energy, it might mean I don't feel like I have the energy to shower. It might mean I don't want to get out of bed today. It might mean I'm feeling so tired, I don't want to see my friends. So if someone is experiencing decreased energy, it might have to do with their mental health as well. Difficulty concentrating is a sign, and then chronic pain is a huge sign of mental health conditions, and we often don't acknowledge it. We work with an individual who helps us with our training. So he lives with bipolar disorder, and in his depressive states, because bipolar disorder includes both the manic or the high energy states, but also depression. In his depressive states, he would get crippling headaches. And so when he would get these headaches, it would be extremely hard for him to function. And so when he is working with us and he's recounting his mental health story, sometimes he feels those headaches and he can remember how bad his headaches were. And so we know that these physical signs are our body telling us that something's wrong. Another thing is tension in the body. Someone who's experiencing anxiety or they're experiencing this overwhelming sense of worry and dread, they might clench their fists, they might have pain in their shoulders. And so tension in the body is a huge sign as well. Another physical sign is having a lack of emotional expression. So if you can't read when you're talking to someone, maybe they just seem very monotone, maybe it's hard for you to kind of engage with them because you can't read where their emotions are at, that could be a sign that's often related to schizophrenia. And then finally, trouble understanding or relating. So those are some physical signs. Other signs are regarding behavior and thoughts, and these are some of the things that we often can see in terms of behavior we can see in other people. When we're thinking about warning signs, someone might have suspiciousness, paranoia, or hypervigilance. So when we're talking about suspiciousness, paranoia, or hypervigilance, it's usually around feeling like other people are talking about them, feeling like other people are watching them, maybe being really on edge and just making sure that someone's watching where they're going. And so this could be either a reaction to something that they've experienced. So say you've experienced a traumatic event. When I was in a housing program, I had someone who tried to reach out to me and basically trap me in a little glass room. It was really pleasant. But when I had that client do that to me, I was hypervigilant for hours and days afterwards. And so it might be in response to a traumatic event, but it also could be something that's coming from experiencing a mental health condition. Like there may not be a reason why someone is feeling this way. And so if you notice that someone's feeling overly suspicious or overly paranoid about people around them, that might be a sign that something's going on. And so with that being said, I'm actually going to skip down to talking about delusions and hallucinations. So if someone's experiencing a delusion, it means that they have a false belief that is fixed. So someone is not open to hearing other people's perspectives. Maybe they don't understand the logic around a delusion, but they believe something to be true that isn't. A delusion could be believing that people are watching them. We've heard cases of someone believing that that all government officials were watching them, that their phone was being hacked, that the government had put a chip in their head and that people could hear their thoughts. So that is a delusion. And what's important about delusions is that it's not useful to try to argue with someone who's experiencing delusion. It's important to focus on the emotion that someone's feeling and saying that must be really frightening, kind of moving forward from there. So we'll talk a little bit more about, tactics for dealing with delusions if you're in a crisis intervention situation. Another component of a warning sign regarding behavior and thoughts is hallucinations or false sensations. So when we think about schizophrenia, for example, what we're actually thinking about is psychosis. And so psychosis is when someone has a break from reality and it's very hard for them to distinguish between what's real and what isn't. And that has to do with not only delusions that people can experience, but also hallucinations. So when someone's experiencing psychosis, they actually might have false sensations. And these sensations can affect all of your five senses. So it can affect your smell, So someone might say that they are smelling smoke in their apartment and you go in there and there's no smoke. That doesn't mean that that person isn't smelling smoke. It also could be auditory. The most common hallucination that people experience are actually auditory. So it might be hearing voices that are telling someone. Usually it's not a voice that's pumping someone up. Usually it's a voice that that's telling someone really scary things. So hallucinations can include that as well. Someone might see something, they might taste something. So it's important when someone says that they are seeing or hearing or tasting something that you don't see to be true, it's important to validate them because for them, it could be very real. Another sign that someone is struggling might be substance use. And so substance use on its own should not be inherently pathologized because we know that so many people use substances, whether it's drugs or, drinking a glass of wine after dinner. Substance use in itself isn't necessarily bad. It's when someone is using substances to the point where it's affecting their daily functioning, or it's hurting the people around them, or they're using substances and it's clearly getting in the way of their life. Or if someone is trying to use more substances than they normally do, that might mean that they're trying to cope with their mental health. One story that stuck with me is we have a NAMI ambassador, which is just a volunteer, who shares her story with the Chicago Police Department. And what she talks about in her story in terms of living with bipolar disorder is a huge warning sign was when she was actually using substances. She was using a lot of painkillers to come down from a manic episode. So she was trying to regulate her mental health when she was feeling that high energy. She was trying to calm down and she used a lot of substances in that time. So that could be a huge warning sign. And similarly, when we're thinking about substance use, I also want you to pay attention to legal substances. If someone is using, recreational marijuana and they are using it in a way that it seems like they're coping with something, that could be a warning sign, but also alcohol. Alcohol is accessible. It's more affordable than a lot of psychiatric medication. And so many people use alcohol as a way to cope. So substance use is a really important warning sign. And then similarly, going back to this idea of baseline, if someone has changes in sleeping, whether they're sleeping a lot or they're sleeping not enough, or they're eating too much or not enough, those are important to pay attention to. Frequent and extreme mood changes are important. Impulsivity and increased risk-taking behavior is also important. And so when I say risk-taking behavior, I don't mean, buying that pair of shoes that they've been thinking about, even though maybe now isn't the best time. I'm thinking about risk-taking behavior in terms of poor judgment. So buying a car when you don't have a great credit score and, you're from one of those dealerships where they're going to totally wreck your credit score if you don't pay. It might mean we've seen this on our helpline, it might mean buying a ticket to Paris for the next day. So that might be a huge issue. And so it's this risk-taking behavior, like shoplifting and things like that, that might actually be a huge warning sign. And finally, thoughts of death or suicide or self-harm. I think we know that this is a huge warning sign, but sometimes it comes up in ways that aren't as clear and we don't know if someone's really struggling. So someone might say, they might be researching suicide on their computer. They might be very enamored and thinking about, other celebrities who have died by suicide. It might be talking about death. If you're a child, that especially is a warning sign that a child's thinking about suicide, is if they're continually talking about death and they're very fixated on it. And then of course, self-harm. So if someone's harming themselves in any way, it usually means that there is a mental health condition or there's some sort of mental health need that needs to be met. So now that I've gone through all of these warning signs, I would love if anyone has any questions, and I'll just wait just a second to see if anyone wants to type anything in the chat.
So I'm not seeing anything at the moment, Sierra.
Okay. If anyone has any questions, we can go back to that towards the end.
Thank you.
Yeah. So when we're thinking about mental health conditions, one of the questions we get is, if someone has a diagnosis, why are they not receiving treatment? So clearly the things that we've been talking about are very life-altering. It would be very hard to engage in your daily functioning if you're experiencing those symptoms. So why would someone choose not to engage in treatment? So as we can see, 40% of adults within any given year are receiving treatment, but that means 60% aren't. And 50% or half of children who have mental health conditions don't receive treatment. One question I want you to put in the chat, or one answer, is just quickly, just whatever comes to your mind, if you could put in, why do you think people don't receive treatment? Even if they have a diagnosis, why might someone not receive treatment? Okay, so we have stigma. At NAMI Chicago, we believe stigma is the #1 barrier to treatment. We see, okay, too expensive. We have fear, so maybe fear around getting treatment, fear around having a diagnosis. Negative side effects of the drugs, absolutely. Maybe someone doesn't have access to mental health care, definitely. Denial. Okay, so I believe, so maybe they're used to these feelings, they've already been coping with them, or they have been experiencing them for a really long time, and feel it's normal, definitely. There's a lot of shame. Okay, great. You all have really, really wonderful answers, and they're all true. So what are the barriers to mental health care? When we're thinking about why people don't receive treatment, it's for all of these reasons. And the biggest reason is stigma. We know that stigma is the #1 barrier to mental health care. If someone feels shame, if they feel fear around having a mental health condition, it's related to negative beliefs about people who have mental health conditions. So we'll go through these a little bit. One barrier to mental health care that's so important is accessibility. And accessibility is an issue we see all over the country, but particularly in Chicago. Chicago is segregated. It's very separated based on where you live and the amount of income you have. And so accessibility might be a huge issue. If I live on the south side of Chicago and I want to find a therapist, it's going to be a lot harder for me to find a therapist on the south side than it is up north or in the Loop. And so we know that based on where someone lives, their accessibility might be harder for them. But also we know accessibility to quality mental health care is an issue as well. So maybe if I live on the south side, I could find mental health care in a community-based agency setting, but maybe the therapists there aren't paid as well. Maybe the therapists there they're not culturally responsive to the needs of, for example, the Black community. So we have to have access to quality mental health care that meets the needs of people who need mental health care. Another barrier to care is insurance. It could be very hard for someone to engage in mental health care depending on their insurance. So whether someone is underinsured or they don't have insurance, or on the other side of the spectrum, maybe you have commercial health insurance and your coverage is awful. And so we know that insurance is a huge barrier to mental health care. And so that's why if you call our helpline, we're going to ask you what insurance or if you don't have insurance, and we're going to try to find you the best resource for you. Another barrier to care is denial. A lot of times people are in denial about experiencing a mental health condition, or they're in denial about their loved one who's experiencing a mental health condition. And that has to do with stigma. It has to do with shame. But we also know that sometimes when people feel like they're experiencing their mental health, it really is hard to imagine what it means for them to have a mental health condition. It can be very, very hard for them to come to terms with that. So there's often a lot of denial, a lot of fear, and a lot of shame. And why do people feel this way? And a lot of that actually has to do with a lack of mental health literacy or a lack of mental health education. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, I did not grow up in a household where we talked about mental health, and I really should have. And it's not anybody's fault. My parents didn't know what they didn't know, and they didn't know about mental health conditions. And why is this? And they didn't know because they had never been personally affected. My parents didn't have any sort of clinical education. We weren't in an area where mental health was discussed. And so when you grow up without having an understanding of mental health conditions, you might think that these negative symptoms that you're experiencing are normal, as someone said. And so this lack of mental health education makes it very hard for people to advocate for themselves, because if they don't know and someone doesn't tell them that it might be related to mental health, they don't have any way to take action. And then distrust in the mental health profession. One example I'd like to give is that if I was told by my general physician, hey, Sierra, you need to have back surgery, I think, oh, that keeps happening where my Siri keeps going off because I say Sierra. Anyway, so say my doctor says, Sierra, you need to have back surgery. I'm going to go to at least 2 other doctors before I make that huge choice because I need to get a second opinion. However, on the other side of things, for me, when I was experiencing mental health symptoms, I waited for far too long to reach out for all of the reasons we've talked about. You know, there was the shame there. I didn't have the education. But when I finally realized, like, hey, maybe this is related to mental health, if I had gone to therapy, and luckily what happened for me is I ended up going to a good therapist, which isn't the case for a lot of people. So say I finally was able to get over the stigma, I was able to kind of get over the hump of struggling with that, and then I finally reach out and I go to a therapist where maybe the therapist asked the wrong question, or maybe they jump to judgments that I don't agree with, or maybe I just don't connect with that therapist. That means it's going to be much more likely for me to not go and try to find, you know, a second or third opinion or a second or third therapist that I connect with. What's more likely to happen is I'm going to say, you know, this whole therapy thing isn't for me. And I know that you probably know, or you might be that person who's experienced that before. But what's important to note about the mental health profession is that it's built up of people as well. And so it's important to find a therapist or a treatment modality that works for you. But why we don't go back after having a bad experience is because there's a distrust in the mental health profession in a way that there isn't a distrust in doctors. At least for some communities. And so one thing to note too is this all relates to stigma. And one important thing to think about in terms of stigma around mental health is that stigma manifests in different ways in different communities. So for example, we know that in the Black community, there's a lot of mental health stigma, and there is in the white community, but it comes out in different ways. And so the stigma around the Black community in terms of mental health, what we see is that if someone's, for example, engaged in their faith community, there might be more stigma around religion and mental health. There might be more stigma because the Black community has been historically marginalized and misdiagnosed and pathologized for just experiencing symptoms. And so when we're thinking about why people don't access care, we cannot take out race, we cannot take out income, we cannot take out life experience. And so it's so important to think about identity in terms of all of these as well. All right, so before we move on, I am wondering if does anyone have any questions, Torlin, that you can see?
So I just sent you a question about the distrust.
I see that.
Yeah, what can you do about it? How do you speak to a participant that finds that this is, I mean, what are some things that I could do or that a person can do when they're speaking to someone about how they feel about distrust?
Yeah, so what I'll say to that, and we'll talk a little bit about basic communication and de-escalation skills, as you can see, but one thing that we can do is really lead by example. So it's because there's so much stigma around mental health, it's important for us as people who understand how much stigma there is to initiate the conversation. So bringing up mental health, not only in terms of, you know, someone else's mental health, but talking about yourself. So normalizing talking about emotions. If you've been to therapy, normalizing the importance of therapy. And I know that it's a little bit different about disclosing when you are in a provider setting, but really just normalizing mental health care, normalizing, you know, taking medication for mental health conditions, you know, sharing stories. Those are the ways that stigma is really broken down. And so I will kind of think about that as we continue to move along for sake of time. But what I want you to pay attention to is that the most important thing around mental health and decreasing stigma is educating yourself, making sure that the people around you are educating, and empowering people to reach out if they need support. So when we're thinking about communication and de-escalation, I'm going to introduce you to a tool called active listening. So this is a framework that we utilize to empower first responders who are responding to mental health crises to utilize. So when we're talking about active listening, I don't want you to just think about verbal components of a conversation, although those are incredibly important. I also want you to know that active listening also includes things like your body language, and it includes the actual situation around you. So what I'm going to talk about now is active listening, and how you can utilize it as a tool, not only in terms of a work setting or with clients. This is something that is useful when you're talking with your partner. It's useful when you're working with your kids, or not working with. I don't think people say that about their children. I don't have kids, if you can't tell. But when we're thinking about active listening, it's something that can be used in the workplace setting, it can be used at home, and it's a skill that gets better the more you practice it. And you can practice it in very small ways. So the important thing to think about when you're thinking about active listening is really making sure that the person that you're engaging with feels like they're being listened to. So it means approaching a conversation by simply asking an open-ended question, which means that the person can't answer, yes or no to it. Because one way to make it hard for someone to engage or make it feel stunted in terms of a conversation is asking closed questions. So if you ask someone, hey, are you good? And they say yes or no, that's going to immediately make them feel, even if that's not your intention, like you don't want to hear what they're saying. So the most important thing to start with is to provide an open-ended question, like, hey, I noticed that you haven't been coming around to my office really lately. How are you doing? So by offering that, it makes the focus of the conversation on the person, not on you, and it gives them the stage to kind of talk about their mental health. Another component of active listening is time. Time is so important in active listening, and it's actually a tool you can use. In our culture, it's very hard for us to spend prolonged amounts of time just in conversation with someone. We're always looking at our phones. In terms of our work, we're always thinking about the things that we need to get done. Our schedules are jam-packed, and it goes against our nature to actually just sit with somebody when they're really struggling. And so using time is a huge resource. So when you're engaging with someone who's struggling in a crisis, I want you to use time, and I want you to be intentional about how can I keep this person here for a little bit longer, because there is a direct correlation between more time in a conversation and someone calming down. Another thing I want you to think about is trust. Your main goal in this is to make someone feel listened to so you can build trust and rapport, because that's how someone's going to feel better. And you can do this through a variety of ways. So things you can do within a conversation are giving people the floor, allowing them to speak, making sure that you are clarifying what they're saying. And this is an often overlooked thing. So saying, hey, after you've been listening for a while, say this person who came to your office who's feeling really down, you can say, hey, you throughout this conversation have mentioned feeling really alone. Am I getting that right? And just making it so that person can clarify what they're saying, so that way the conversation doesn't proceed with you having the wrong message and them not feeling heard. Another thing you can do is use empathy statements. So empathy is really putting yourself in the shoes of another person as compared to sympathy. So sympathy would be, I have pity for how you're feeling. So it might be you feel bad for that client, but you don't know what they're going through, and you just kind of have that surface level understanding that they're struggling. Empathy is looking at your client and saying, I know what it feels like to feel alone. I know what it feels like to open up to someone when you don't know how they're going to respond. I know how it feels to feel really down or feel really burdened. And so it's really focusing on making sure that you're labeling whatever emotion they're feeling and thinking about how you yourself have experienced that. And that builds empathy, and people can feel that. This can be the same even if you've never experienced anything like what a client is going through. So say you have a client who is experiencing a hallucination. I worked in a housing program, and we had a client who was convinced that the janitorial staff was actually going on the roof of the building and walking around at all hours of the night. Of course, the janitorial staff was not doing that. But because she was experiencing this hallucination where she could hear these footsteps, and she had this fixed false belief, she had this delusion, there was no reasoning, because logic is just something that you can't utilize in that situation. But what we did in terms of our housing program is I and the other case managers thought about how have we felt in that situation? How would we feel if we were, continually making complaints that weren't being addressed? How would we feel if we felt like we were having a conversation and people were trying to reason with us when we had really staunch belief that this was happening? And so by focusing on that emotion, by focusing on her frustration, by focusing on just all of the impact this was having in her life, I was able to have empathy for a situation that I had never experienced before. And so you can do that with any situation. And how you can label emotions is you can just say, that must be really frustrating, or you must really feel alone. And just by allowing that and labeling that emotion, it validates what a person is going through. Because when someone's struggling with their mental health, oftentimes we don't want, like someone doesn't want to have advice just given to them. You don't have to have all the right answers. When someone comes to you and they're just venting, they just want to feel heard. So that's something you can do, is really just using that emotional labeling piece. So here are some other things you can do. So those are some verbal things you can do, but also I want you to pay attention to your body language. So there's some examples in this list. I'm not going to read it all to you, but your body language can send the message that you're really invested in the conversation or that you're not. And it's something that I actively have to work on. My inclination is often to kind of lean to the side and do a more relaxed pose, or sometimes I'll cross my arms over my chest without even realizing it, just because I'm paying attention. And that can seem very standoffish. It can seem like I'm just waiting for this person to finish up, and even if I'm not. And so it's important to pay attention to what is your body language and how are you communicating with your body language. In addition, if you're feeling afraid, so if you are feeling really, really afraid that you don't know how this interaction is going to end with a client, maybe they're feeling really aggressive, your body language can communicate that you feel afraid or that you want them to leave. And it's so important to, before you walk into that conversation, or if you realize that conversation is happening where someone's in crisis, to take a step back and think about your body language. Another key thing to pay attention to is your tone. Your tone of voice matters so much. If you say, if you're talking to someone and you say, I'm really concerned about your well-being, and you say it in a very calm, clear tone that really conveys your emotion, that's going to go over well, rather than if you say it in a tone that is really fast-paced, or if you're speaking far too loudly and it makes someone uncomfortable. You have to pay attention to your volume and your tone. Other things you can do is maintain eye contact. It's really hard to do, especially when someone's in crisis, but by maintaining eye contact, it makes a person feel heard. You can also personalize the situation. So for example, if you are working with a client who's new, or maybe you've never communicated with them before, it's important when you start the conversation to say like, hey, my name's Sierra Peterson, I'm a case manager here, how can I be helpful? Other things to pay attention to, and this is often very hard in a housing context, is to reduce environmental stimuli. So in a housing situation, if you're in, for example, an apartment building and a client is having an issue and they're speaking very loudly, or maybe a client's feeling anxious, it's important to make sure that you're limiting the environmental stimuli. You're making sure that unnecessary people aren't around, so that there aren't other clients who are watching, or that if there's 10 staff members in the room, you really pay attention to how few can we have in here and still be safe. Also reducing things like bright lighting, making sure if someone feels trapped because the door is shut. And what you can do is just ask them, where do you prefer that we go into a room where, it's just you and I talking? And so just making sure that you are paying attention to the environment in addition to the conversation. And one thing to note is I'm not advocating for you to put yourself in harm's way. So if it's not a safe thing to be able to be in a room with a client alone, I don't want you to do that, even if that's what they want. You have to work within what you have, and it's always important that you feel safe. And so another thing to do is to focus on their feeling, not their content. So if if someone's talking about how paranoid they are that people are watching them, you don't have to go into, oh, how long have they been watching you? Where are they? What do these people look like? You can just focus on, that must be extremely difficult. Can you tell me more about that? So these are just some things to pay attention to. And if you have any questions about specific tactics, I want you to ask in the chat. But what's important is not only what we do in this situation, it's also what we need to avoid. As I said, the number one thing is about building trust and utilizing time. And so these are some things that you can really avoid that might re-escalate someone. One thing that we tend to do, just as people who are trying to calm someone down, is we might make promises we can't keep. This sounds worse than it often comes out, but you might actually be able to recognize a time you made a promise where you couldn't keep. So for example, you have a client who comes to your office and they are completely against going to this group tonight. So maybe there is a support group at your organization and they are required to go because of program protocol. And maybe this person is so distraught about going that they ask, hey, I'll go to this group if you go with me for the next 3 weeks. And although in that moment you might want to say yes, it's important to have boundaries and it's important to be transparent. That is the kindest thing you can do. And so what you can do is say, you know, of course, I would love to be able to support you in that way, but that isn't an option right now. So how can we move forward? And kind of pass it back to them and give them control. But sometimes what we do is, even if we don't have an intention of following through with our promise, we might say it just to calm somebody down. So we might say, yeah, that's fine, you know, and then later in the day, you just anticipate telling them that you can't. And this breaks trust. So it's important to not make promises that you can't keep. Similarly, if you have a client that you're worried about because maybe they're having suicidal thoughts, don't promise that you won't tell anybody. It's so important to say, I can't promise that I can't tell anybody because I'm worried about you, and it's important that you get help. Another thing to avoid is demanding obedience. And so you can tell that this was written for a more law enforcement background, but we also, as clinicians, we might demand obedience in different ways. We might say, I need you to get out of my office right now, or I'm going to have to do a write-up. Or if you act in XYZ way, this is what I'm going to have to do. And so if you're demanding that someone obey you in that moment, whether it's even just lowering their voice, going to a different room, that's also going to break trust. Of course, you have to do what you have to do in terms of your policy and protocol, but demanding obedience can really hinder a relationship. Another thing to avoid is engaging in a power struggle. So this can look like a client saying, a good example of this, it's a little bit hard in this context to describe, but say you have a client, or I had that client who was working, or I was working with, that felt like the janitor was on the roof, okay? And a power struggle might have been her saying, you know, this person's on my roof, he's keeping me up at night, can't you hear him? And then me saying, no, that didn't exist, that isn't possible. And then going back and forth with this person where they're trying to reason with me, I'm trying to reason with them, and there's this power struggle over who's right. That is so not useful in this situation. That's why we focus on active listening, and that's why we focus on the empathy and emotional labeling, because getting bogged down in the weeds and engaging in this power struggle will break trust. Other things, of course, acting angry or afraid can make someone feel like you don't trust them. It might make them feel like it's harder for them to open up. Another thing that's important to note as a provider is acting very over emotional when someone tells us that they're struggling. We have to put on a brave face and know that this is a common thing. Like I said, 1 in 5 of us will experience a mental health condition. So if someone says that they're really struggling and it takes you by surprise, it's really on us to make sure that our emotional response doesn't reflect that. Another thing is laughing. Sometimes people will say absurd things, or, you know, we might just be uncomfortable and we will laugh. I know that I have that problem. It's important to not laugh, but also if you do, it's important to just apologize. Just say, I'm so sorry. You know, this is a really uncomfortable situation and I'm trying my best to handle this. Like, I'm very sorry for laughing. And similarly, if you say anything that rubs someone the wrong way in the conversation, you can just apologize and still keep that trust. Another thing is speaking in a patronizing tone. Don't talk down to somebody who's experiencing a mental health condition. Just try not to. Even if they are coming at you and they're irritable and maybe they're saying things that rub you the wrong way, just do your best to maintain a really, really calm, supportive tone throughout. And finally, don't engage in psychosis. We see this a lot when we're working with people who experience psychosis regularly, where sometimes they will try to engage in that person's delusion or hallucination in order to calm them down. So for example, if I had said to the person who is in the housing program where they thought someone was on the roof, if I had said, you know, oh, I hear them. Yeah, you're right. Let's go down to the office and file a complaint. If I had engaged in that psychosis just to calm her down, there is the chance that it could work, but there's very much a chance that it might not. And she might say, no, he's not up there right now. You can't hear him. And then my trust is completely obliterated. So do not engage in psychosis. Instead, focus on the emotion. And one thing to pay attention through all of this that is so key is something called provider anxiety. And you can look this up on the internet. It's a really good concept to know. As providers, we put so much pressure on ourselves to make sure that our clients are okay and make sure we don't do the wrong thing, not only because it's our job, but because we are in a system where we hospitalize people who show the slightest bit of mental health concern. But that might actually be your program's protocol, is to hospitalize someone or to call the police if there is a crisis. And so we put a ton of pressure on ourselves, and we might get anxious to the point where we escalate a situation. So if you're walking into a situation, you have a client who is maybe feeling really alone or isolated, make sure you give them the floor to just talk, and make sure that you aren't trying to be solutions focused when they just need you to provide support. So don't try to be there and give them the referral. Don't try to force them to go to the hospital right away. And if you have concerns about whether or not someone needs psychiatric care, please feel free to call us. You can give them our number. We can call with you, or you can call with them. We're here to help you in that way. So now that we've talked about communication and de-escalation skills, I just want to quickly go over some emergency resources before we just go through a few scenarios. So the first emergency resource is the Chicago Police Department's Crisis Intervention, or CIT team. So NAMI is involved in the Crisis Intervention Team, or CIT. We provide 20 of the 40 hours that these officers go through. Right now, it is a voluntary training that officers who have 2 years on the job can go through to learn how to de-escalate a mental health crisis. They learn everything from mental health signs and symptoms to hearing the stories of people who have worked with law enforcement when they were really, really struggling, to practicing scenarios where they de-escalate someone using verbal language only. And so this is something you can call if there is a mental health emergency, and it is an absolute last resort. I know just the context that so many people of color have had to live with in terms of the police as not being used as a resource makes this really difficult. But the reality is, unfortunately, sometimes our system only allows for the police to be called. And I do not advocate for it. I think that if you have to, it's important to call for a CIT officer. So to call for a CIT officer, what you can do is you can call 911. You can say there's a mental health emergency, provide as much information as you need. And then at that point, say, I would like a CIT officer. I will say that 911 is trained to know when a CIT emergency is happening, and so they might ask for a CIT officer regardless, but it's important to ask. If you call for a CIT officer, it does not mean that one will actually respond. About half of the time, CIT officers will respond to a mental health emergency. And the difference between a CIT officer and a non-CIT trained officer is that a CIT officer has the knowledge of how to verbally de-escalate someone, and they also know how to fill out the paperwork to have someone be hospitalized and get assessed, rather than kind of leaving the situation or criminalizing someone who's experiencing a mental health condition. So that's CIT. Any specific questions about that training, please feel free to ask, because I facilitate that training, so I can be helpful. But like I said, I know this is a last resort. That's why call our helpline if you have an issue, and we can try to work through a non-law enforcement response. Finally, Smart 911. So Smart 911 is a resource that you can utilize. You can just Google it, and it is an app, and it's also a website. You can fill out a profile that will come up. So this information will come up on the screen of a 911 call taker when you call 911 if you ever have to. This is perfect for someone who has someone with a mental health condition that's had to use a crisis response before, or if you have a loved one who's maybe an older adult that might live alone and you're worried about them. So you can fill out this free, totally confidential resource, and you can put things like your home address. You can tie a phone number to the account, so if you call 911, it will pop up. And you can also put things like, you know, these are where the emergency exits are in our house. We have pets. This is my mother's medication. These are the signs and symptoms that, you know, my brother experiences when he's experiencing a mental health crisis. So those are things that you can plug in, so it makes it more likely that if there is a crisis response, the police officer or the ambulance will come to the scene knowing what's going on, and thus create a better access to care. So those are a few resources, and I hope that they're useful for you. We can also, if someone doesn't have, you know, the internet or an app, we on our helpline can help you fill out a Smart 911 profile. So now I just want to quickly go through a few scenarios and get people's perspectives. And Torlin, I greatly appreciate you letting me know what people's answers are. So scenario number 1, you are in an entrance to your building prior to the pandemic, and you notice a client that you know but haven't worked with before is pacing and muttering to themselves. As you approach, they engage you in conversation and say they're being watched. As they continue to speak quickly or more rapidly, they become more and more agitated as they notice other clients staring. What are some things you could do to change the environment for this person? How can you control the environment to make it a more calming space for them? What are some things you might do given your experience working with people? One thing we have is make direct eye contact. Yes. So making the person feel heard by providing direct eye contact and focusing your attention on them. That is a great way to engage with them. And so if you'd like, when you're considering the environment and also like how you can make it a calming situation, what are some things in your verbal response that you could do? What are some things you could say to them? I hear you. I hear you is a very powerful, simple thing that you can say. So often we don't think to just recognize and say, you know, I hear your concerns. Yes, speaking in a calm tone. Speaking in a calm tone is key in this situation. And it might be very difficult in this particular situation because the client is agitated and you don't know them very well because you haven't worked with them before. So it's important to pay attention to how are you feeling going into this conversation and how can you be calm. So absolutely being calm, letting someone know that you hear them. Yes, saying who you are. So personalizing the encounter, saying, hi, you know, my name's Sierra Peterson. I'm a case manager here. I've seen you around, but I haven't been able to introduce myself. Yeah, let's talk about this. Those are very important. Yes, ask them if they want to sit and talk about it. The best thing you can do is ask them, you know, is there a better place we could go talk? Because as you can see, there are other clients around. It's so important to make sure that that person feels like they have privacy and make them feel like they are in control. Clearly, this person feels like they're out of control. There's something going on that they're very distressed about. It is so important to ask them how they want to proceed. Yeah, simply asking, how can I help? That is a great answer. By asking someone, what can I do for you today? How can I be helpful? We can find out whether someone wants a direct answer, they want a resource, or they just want to talk. One thing to note too, with many clients and just working with people who are, you know, feeling out of control or in crisis, they might say in the beginning of a conversation that they want a very specific thing. So they might say, I want a complaint filed against this person. And of course, like that might be what seems to be the issue. And you're like, yeah, let me go get the paperwork. And you think that's going to diffuse them. Oftentimes people really just want to be validated. They want to be heard. So by making sure that you're giving them time, even if they tell you they want this very specific task done, making sure you're validating them and hearing their concerns out first might make it to the point where they calm down to the point where they don't actually need to file a complaint or whatever they're asking for. Great. So some other things that I would think about in terms of this is thinking about how can you make it so other clients aren't around to be distracting? How do you make sure that you're maybe communicating with your coworkers to make sure that they know something's going on and so you can feel safe? Another thing to pay attention to is to make sure that you know your agency's protocol. So if someone's experiencing mental health system or symptoms and they're in distress, what is your agency's crisis protocol? Many agencies don't have this, but it's important at least to ask your supervisor, hey, if this situation were to happen, what should I do? Similarly, it's important to know who you call within your agency if there is an issue. So if you work at a larger agency where maybe you have a branch of, therapeutic counseling, or maybe there's a support group, it's important to know who can you call in that situation. And then of course, using the tools that we've talked about before, it's so important to build trust. And so that's what I'm getting at when I say next steps. It's important to use these active listening skills, diffuse the situation, have a good verbal response, and then know what your next steps are within your role. So the next scenario is you are meeting with a client that you've built strong rapport with, and they seem more reserved than they usually do. You decide to ask if they're feeling okay, to which they respond, no. As you spend more time with the client, they mention they haven't been able to sleep and that it feels like they wouldn't matter if they were gone. So I would love to hear your thoughts. What, for example, do you think you could do in the environment to make someone feel safe? What might your verbal response be? What are some things that you can do? And also, what do you think this client is struggling with? Like, what do you think is going on there? So one person thought that maybe this client is having suicidal thoughts, or we also call that suicidal ideation. And yes, that is what we're getting at when we think about this. A lot of times, and sometimes it does happen where people are very upfront and they say, I'm thinking of dying by suicide, or I'm thinking of killing myself. This situation shows that maybe someone's experiencing suicidal thoughts because they feel like it wouldn't matter if they're gone. This person seems to be feeling hopeless. It seems to be like they're feeling like they're very alone and that they're isolated. And so that's where you can start. You can always start with, it sounds like you're feeling really hopeless. Is that what you're feeling right now? And then allow them to elaborate. Say, I'd like to hear more about that. Another thing you can do is ask an open-ended question, like, just asking, what does it feel like when you feel really hopeless? Have you felt this way before? Is this something that you normally feel? What do you normally do when you feel like this? Those are some ways to make the person feel heard, and it's very solution focused. It allows them to express themselves, and it allows them to also see, what are some things that I've done in the past that have made me feel better? Another thing that might be important, yes, someone says something appears to have happened, I would ask follow-up questions. That is a great approach to have. We don't want to shut down the situation. We want to make sure that this person knows that they have a place where they can speak and where they can be heard. Another thing that's important is if someone's experiencing suicidal ideation, it's also important to ask, and you don't have to ask this right away. I'm not suggesting that you open the question or you open this conversation with your client by saying, have you ever thought of hurting yourself? But I am saying it might be important, and it is important, I will say, to, during this conversation, make sure that you are asking, have you ever had thoughts like this before? Have you ever thought of harming yourself before? And then further going on to say, have you thought about how you would do it? How often do you think about this? Do you have the means, or do you have a way that you would do it? And do you have the ability to hurt yourself in that way? And so while these are very scary, they're very dark questions, what we know from people who have experienced suicidal ideation that we work with is that it's actually very validating to have someone just simply ask those questions, because it makes people feel like they're not alone. It makes them feel like they have someone who at least understands that this is something that they might be going through. And it also opens up the possibility that someone might be able to help them. And so when you ask these questions, it shows that you're saying, I see you. I see what you're going through. I see how hard this is for you, and I want to know more about it. And so this is where your organization's crisis policy really comes into play. So if it turns out that, for example, someone is feeling suicidal and they have the means to do it and they've really thought about it and you're worried that they're at risk of hurting themselves, it's important to know, what is the next step for you in your role? Is it that you are going to accompany that person to an ER? Is it that they need to reach out to their care team? Maybe they have a therapist or a psychiatrist. It's important to loop them in. Doesn't mean that they're going to go to the hospital on their own. Like it depends on what the situation is. And so if you are worried about a client who's feeling suicidal, you can call our helpline. So while we don't primarily take crisis calls, we're all trained in suicide screening, and we can be helpful to figure out the level of risk someone's in. And the reality is about suicidal ideation is that some people just exist in this space, unfortunately. Some people have days where they just feel very down and they think about ending their life, but if they haven't taken any steps towards it, or they don't have any real plans, it doesn't necessarily mean that they need to be hospitalized against their will. So it's important to kind of suss that out and figure out, based on that person's baseline, based on the information that you've gathered, what risk level they're at. And if you have questions about this, I really, really would push you to ask your supervisor about what your agency is doing around suicidal ideation, because it's better to have a proactive plan. Another thing to note is that NAMI Chicago can be helpful in creating a crisis policy. We've created crisis policies for other organizations. So let me know if you have questions about that. And finally, I really like, one participant said, one thing you can ask is, when was the last time you felt like this and what helped to change it in the past? And so by focusing on what helped to change it, after you've given them ample time to vent, it can make someone feel really empowered to kind of take control of their wellness, because maybe they're just having a bad day and they need to be reminded about all the things and the resources they have in their toolbox to help themselves. So make sure that if you have any questions, you can call us. We're here to help you with this, because it's really hard. Yeah, someone asked, should you ask, do you have a plan? Definitely an important thing to ask. And if you need more resources, you can go to www.namichicago.org. We have some resources on there as well. So now that we've gone through a few scenarios, I actually want to open it up for questions. So do any of you have any questions around any of the warning signs that we've talked about, crisis intervention situations, any cases that you've had that you want to go through? I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. Oh yes, I can definitely, I'll put my contact information in the chat right now as I am waiting for other questions. The best way to get in touch with me is through email, because we're all remote right now. I can of course set up a call with you, or there's other people on our team that I can introduce you to if they're a better fit regarding a specific situation, but yes. You can also find me on LinkedIn. So I answer LinkedIn messages as well, if that's easier.
So everyone, the recording of this presentation will be available at another time. So just to answer everyone's question, they were curious about the recording. So yes, it'll be available. And then I will send a follow-up email with the next steps.
Great. So no other questions, Torlin?
No other questions.
Great. Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation. I know that 2 hours is only so long to talk about mental health. So one thing I want to note is, like I said, a lot of us have experienced mental health conditions. A lot of us have people in our lives who've experienced mental health conditions. And this topic touched on things like signs and symptoms and suicide. So if you are feeling like this was a little bit heavy, make sure to take care of yourself. So whether that means making sure that you take a walk today during your workday, or reaching out to our helpline if you need to, like, make sure that you're taking care of yourself as well, because that's so important. And thank you for your engagement. Thanks for coming. It was great to talk to you, and I hope to talk to you if you need anything after this presentation.
Okay. And real quickly, everyone, please remember the link inside of the chat is for the survey. So if you could complete that for me, I'd appreciate it. Sierra, you got comments from thank you. This was awesome. Thank you. It was very informative and useful.
Oh, thank you. That's leading me into a great weekend. I appreciate you all.
Okay.
All right.